Apollo or Dionysus? It's a question that we've been obsessed with for centuries, even if the ancient Greeks didn't necessarily ask it themselves. And maybe, by trying to answer this dilemma of godly proportions, we can find a better way forward for ourselves. Apollo and Dionysus present one of the most compelling dichotomies in all of Western mythology, even though we don't actually find them clashing in the annals of said mythology. Instead, it's curious European thinkers in the last few centuries who found something compelling by contrasting the two. For thinkers like Nietzsche, the concepts that these two gods embody are placed in opposition to each other and represent something of an eternal tug of war over the soul of man. Now, some people find this approach overly reductive, and to be honest, I was starting to wonder if there was even anything there myself. And rather than take some Nietzsche YouTuber's word for it, or even that of the mustached maestro himself, I decided to come at it in my own way. I decided to go back to the myths themselves and read up on the archaeology to sketch out portraits of the two gods and see if that intense contrast is really there. And once I did have a clearer picture of the divinities in question, I started to ponder what, if anything, their supposed rivalry could teach us here in 2025. So yeah, Friedrich is sitting this one out, but I promise it's going to be a fascinating journey nonetheless. So to get started in earnest, we need to understand who we're even talking about. Apollo and Dionysus are some of the more familiar names among the many gods of ancient Greece, but at best, many people are only familiar with a singular aspect of these divine beings. For example, people will usually note that Poseidon is simply the god of the seas and leave it at that, which ignores so much of that particular god's depth and breadth. So let's take a little time to flesh out the two gods we're talking about, and we'll start with Apollo. Apollo is one of the young Olympians, born after Zeus's overthrow of the Titan Cronus. He's the son of Zeus and the Titaness Leto. He's also the twin brother of Artemis, the huntress. Due to who his parents are, Apollo is born fully divine and does not have to suffer in the manner of Zeus's other mortal-born progeny, such as Hercules. As a younger god, Apollo is typically portrayed in the prime of his youth. He's well-formed, toned, and without blemish. He's essentially the ideal man, with everything in proportion and nothing in excess. The Apollo Belvedere, seen here, really encapsulates how the Greeks and Romans understood Apollo throughout much of the classical and Hellenistic eras. There are also the Kuroi statues of the early classical period, which are often thought to be representations of Apollo because they are idealized youths, albeit in a much more archaic fashion, and they are typically found in sacred spaces that were associated with Apollo. Now, as for the divine aspects of Apollo, he's one of the more multifaceted gods. Most of us know him as the god of the sun, but even that is something of an oversimplification. He really inherits the mantle of sun god from the Titan Helios, and really only represents the light of the sun rather than the celestial body itself, which is still said to be the aforementioned Titan. That distinction did blur at times, especially as Apollo was conflated with other solar deities, such as Sol Invictus in the later years of the Roman Empire. Beyond his solar aspect, Apollo is also recognized as the god of poetry, music, pastoralism, archery, order, prophecy, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, science, and inspiration. Clearly, he's a busy guy. Un dio occupato, as we might say in Italian. Despite how prominent he is in Greek myth, Apollo seems to be a more recent addition to the Greek pantheon, at least in comparison to Dionysus, who is attested far back in Mycenaean civilization. Apollo may have come to the Greeks through Anatolia, where various Indo-European peoples, notably the Hittites, worshipped a god with a very similar name. This transmission of worship from one culture to another wasn't actually that uncommon in the ancient world, and we're fairly certain that this was the case with at least one other Greek god, specifically Aphrodite, who came from the Near East, where she was known variously as Astarte or Inanna. In any case, the classical Greeks certainly saw Apollo as their guy, and in his myths, he operates mainly in the Greek heartlands and at its immediate frontiers, i.e. Western Anatolia. He was also central to the idea of Greek expansion or colonialism, with the god's blessing and foresight required for the adventurous Greeks who were setting out to found new cities. Apollo's main claim to fame in mythology is the slaying of the serpent Python, and his ascension as lord over the oracle at Delphi, the main source of prophecy in the Greek world. We also see him in the Trojan War cycle, lending his aid to the Trojans, shooting volleys of disease-inducing arrows into the ranks of the Greeks. Other myths concern his musical duel with the satyr Marsyas, where Apollo's lyre is put to the test, or we can look to his dominion over the Muses, the sources of inspiration for many creative and intellectual pursuits. Taken all together, we get this picture of Apollo as a god who embodies intellectual and creative pursuits, order and precision, and the ability to see far beyond our natural limits. As for Dionysus, he's a little easier to pin down in terms of his essential qualities, but he's also a far more mysterious and enigmatic figure. Like Apollo, Dionysus is one of the younger Olympians, but unlike his radiant half-brother, Dionysus is half-mortal. He's the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Semele, a princess of Thebes in most tellings. As one conceived with a mortal mother, Dionysus spends a long time wandering the earth in the flesh before he can even ascend to Mount Olympus. Perhaps because of his mortal side, we see Dionysus portrayed across the full breadth of the human lifespan, from innocent toddler to fresh-faced youth to lecherous old man. Dionysus was actually born 2 times, having died and been reconstituted twice, with his time in Semele's womb only being his second nativity. Zeus actually carried him to term in the final bout, and I kid you not, by sewing Dionysus into his thigh. Once in the world, he makes his purpose and his abilities well known. He is, of course, famously the god of wine. That essential aspect is present in all the ways that Dionysus is depicted, across his lifespan, usually with a bundle of grapes and often entwined or crowned with vines, often ivy. In addition to his role as the god of wine, Dionysus is also the god of fecundity, ecstasy, vegetation, and festivities. Dionysus has some other interesting aspects to him that are worth reflecting on as well. For example, Dionysus is regarded as something of a foreigner and a wanderer among the ancient Greeks. Even though there is ample evidence that the Mycenaeans worshipped Dionysus, the classical and Hellenistic Greeks seemed to regard him as coming from far away. Dionysus is said to have his origins in places as close to the Greek world as Thrace or Anatolia, or as far off as Palestine or even Arabia. The Greeks definitely thought he traveled extensively in the East at the very least, with one of the more interesting chapters of his mythology concerning his conquests in the Far East, where he and his army, more on them in a bit, invaded and subjugated India. The ecstasy associated with Dionysus is one of the more pervasive aspects of his mythology. The army that Dionysus takes with him to India and throughout the ancient world is composed mostly of women and satyrs who have fallen into a sort of madness or mania that Dionysus inspires. These maenads are not simply drunk, they're in the throes of an orgiastic insanity. And this mania that Dionysus inspires confers some interesting properties. Notably, the ability for hordes of these maenads to tear men and beasts apart with their bare hands. Dionysus wields a staff entwined with vines and tipped with a pine cone, which alludes to the phallic and fertile aspects of the god. And as a god of vegetation, we often see Dionysus spreading vines, such as ivy, wherever he travels, which reinforces his identity as a god of fertility, since he's literally spreading his seed and generating life, chaotic as it may be at times. But I think the most intriguing aspects of Dionysus are those which entangle him with the ancient mysteries. He's something of a proto-Christ, a son of God who dies and rises again, performing miracles concerning wine and cultivating a dedicated legion of disciples. His ability to inspire altered states of mind turn him into a spirit guide of sorts, leading initiates into deeper mysteries that are found in the collective unconscious. And in his guise as the Wanderer, Dionysus embodies the idea of exotic Eastern cults arriving on the Mediterranean shore, like the time that he arrives in Thebes and threatens the stability of Pentheus's kingdom in the play The Bacchae. When we look at these two gods, the differences between them and what they represent are actually quite stark. Apollo, when you reduce him down to his essence, is the enlightened and rational soul. He's the light of knowledge which inspires both creative and scientific thought. Apollo is also transcendent divinity, something ultimately beyond humanity. He's order, organized religion, the state, and the national ideal. Dionysus, on the other hand, is the unconscious and irrational soul. He is the wine which subsumes us into a state of nature and, well, let's say spiritual release. Dionysus, in contrast to Apollo, is tangible divinity, that is the undying divine potential that's contained within us. He's also chaos, the primordial cult, he who knows no borders, and the stranger in our midst. Now, all that said, these two gods are not entirely opposites. They do share a number of overlapping qualities that we need to consider. I think the most basic and obvious overlap between the two gods is their Christology, for lack of a better term. We have to remember that Christianity was born in a largely Hellenized Near East. Now, I've already mentioned that Dionysus preempts Christ as a dying and rising god, one conceived of a divine being and a mortal woman, and one who works miracles with wine. And while he doesn't specifically turn water into wine in any of the myths that come down to us, such a feat would certainly have been a trifle for Dionysus. Like Jesus, Dionysus also wandered with his band of disciples, and his cult was seen as subversive and a threat to the established order, which led to the persecution of said followers. Apollo also has a number of Christ-like qualities, but these tend to be more surface level. In many mosaics, frescoes, and in some sculptural depictions, Apollo and his related solar personas are depicted with a radiant halo, which Christians adopted later on in their depiction of Jesus and the many saints. In similar media, such as Christian-era mosaics, we also find Christ depicted in the fashion of Apollo, as a young, beardless youth wearing Greco-Roman attire, which, ultimately blurs the line between the two divinities. And just as Apollo may be invoked for poetic inspiration or prophecy, so too is Jesus credited with inspiring the church fathers to write scripture and theology, and with creating and fulfilling prophecies of his own arrival and eventual return. Both Dionysus and Apollo are also seen as patrons of the arts, Apollo more so, but Dionysus to a degree as the spirit of literary and theatrical tragedy, and of the more chaotic and primal forms of music. We also see that in many places across the Greek world, both gods were worshipped at the same sites, though not always necessarily at the same time of year. I might also quickly mention the figure of Orpheus, who acts as a literal nexus between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Orpheus receives his lyre from Apollo in some tellings of the myth, and has mastered the Apollonian art of music to such a degree that he can charm and overcome monsters and even sway gods. And in his journey to the underworld and his attempt to restore his wife Eurydice to life, we see the mysteries of Dionysus and his transcendence over the cycle of life and death. I should note as well that Orpheus was often claimed to be a priest of Dionysus too. When you take everything together, the construction of Apollonian versus Dionysian is largely an interpretive effort on the part of later thinkers. We look at qualities such as, Apollo being an archer and Dionysus unleashing vines, and then we just read in the opposing qualities of precision and disorderly growth, for example. The arrow is targeted, whereas the vine overcomes in a tangled mess. But just because this understanding of the two gods is a later invention, that doesn't mean that it's bereft of value. The gods are eternal, and so are the concepts that they represent. You could say that by reflecting on their nature, they have revealed these truths to us and are helping us find a useful framework for understanding our own humanity. I'm fairly certain that if someone as famous as Nietzsche had turned their mind to exploring the triad of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, for example, some profound truths probably would have emerged from there as well. So if we were to examine Western civilization, circa 2025, and look for traces of Apollo and Dionysus, which god would we find more often than not? Well, if you ask me, while there are certainly aspects of both the Apollonian and Dionysian in our present world, I believe the balance tips decisively in the direction of Apollo. Our world is governed by data and systems and an endless drive towards innovation. Everything is analyzed, rationalized, and speculated over, almost to the point of absurdity. Almost nothing exists outside of a system of control that is made to regulate and perfect human behavior. And what beliefs we do have are wrapped up in doctrines that promise endless progress and the calculated transcendence of the human experience. Sadly, Apollo's more creative aspects have, however, deteriorated as we've focused entirely on the intellectual and rational domains of the Apollonian. Technology is seen as superior to art, politics to philosophy, and math over meter. What there is of the Dionysian in our societies is limited to the baser aspects of the god, and sadly, even these are rigorously controlled. Intoxication and mind-altering experiences are kind of our only connection to the god, but again, both are regulated and punished by the state. And, we have no mystery cults, no freedom to wander and truly give ourselves over to the rapture of nature, and all of the generative energy seems to have been sucked out of our civilization, with the cycle of birth and death slowly losing its momentum. But I don't think the answer here is as simple as saying that we should cast down Apollo and raise up Dionysus. It's also not as simple as saying that we should just meet the two gods in the middle. We can't cast away everything Apollo has to offer because the light of wisdom has kind of helped us rise far above the animals and build a civilization that was, and I think still is, worth marveling at. And he is the far-seeing god who's going to lead us into the future. And for that reason, we should adore him more and seek his guidance in the majority of our pursuits. But we need Dionysus as well. We long for experiences that can only really be felt and not understood. We need to be able to break our boundaries and find a little bit of mystery in the world again. And most importantly, we need to spread our seed and grow vigorously like the vine if our civilization is going to survive. So, having gone through all that, I certainly think that the distinctions we draw between the two gods, Apollo and Dionysus, are not quite as stark as we first assumed, although there is some there. And I think it's clear that we ultimately can't rely on one to the exclusion of the other for our, let's say, salvation. Instead, we need to look at the myths in the same way that we would regard a mirror. They're there to teach us something about ourselves by offering a glimpse of the divine within and around us. And what lessons we take away from seeing ourselves in those ancient tales of gods and monsters and heroes is ultimately going to depend on who's gazing into the mirror and when.